You begin from an assumption so familiar, it rarely appears as an assumption at all. You believe that knowing depends on thinking. When thought is active, awareness feels present. When thought subsides, awareness seems to fade. Silence, in this view, appears empty, inactive, or merely a pause between mental events. Yet this belief is never examined. It is inherited. Ibn Arabi questioned this inheritance directly. He asked whether awareness truly begins with thought, or whether thought only arises within something already aware. If knowing depended on mental movement, awareness would vanish whenever thinking stopped. But have you ever confirmed such a disappearance? Or have you only noticed the absence of commentary? The question emerges quietly. Is silence the absence of knowing, or the condition that makes knowing possible at all? You notice how quickly awareness is defined in terms of mental activity. To be aware, you assume you must be thinking, processing, remembering, or narrating. When thoughts slow or pause, you conclude that awareness has weakened. This conclusion feels obvious, but it rests on a habit rather than an observation. You have learned to recognize awareness only when it carries content. Ibn Arabi treats this habit as a basic confusion. Thought is something that appears. Awareness is what registers that appearance. When you confuse the two, awareness seems to rise and fall with thought. But this is an inference, not a fact. You have never observed awareness itself coming or going. You have only observed thoughts doing so. Consider this carefully. When a thought ends, something knows that it has ended. That knowing is not the thought itself. If awareness were identical with thought, nothing would register the absence of thought. Yet absence is known immediately. This suggests that awareness does not depend on mental narration to function. It only seems to, because narration is what you usually notice. The habit persists because it is practical. Thought allows orientation and explanation, but practicality is not proof. The question remains open. Does thought produce knowing? Or does knowing simply host thought when it appears? Ibn Arabi's position is precise and difficult to absorb. That he does not claim that thought is irrelevant. He claims that thought is secondary. Awareness is not an effect of cognition. It is not assembled by mental operations. It does not arrive when thinking begins or depart when thinking ends. He invites a simple inquiry. Has awareness ever announced its absence? You may recall moments of confusion, distraction, or mental noise. You may recall moments of quiet or mental stillness, but in none of these cases does awareness itself disappear. Only its contents change. If awareness depended on activity, it would be unstable. It would flicker on and off with every shift in attention. Yet, you experience continuity. Even when attention wanders, something registers that wandering. Even when thought pauses, something knows that nothing is being thought. Ibn Arabi does not ask you to believe this. He asks whether you have ever directly observed the alternative. Have you ever encountered a gap where awareness itself was missing? Or have you only inferred absence from the lack of mental commentary? This question introduces tension. If awareness does not depend on activity, then silence cannot be inert. It must be something else entirely. The inquiry turns toward that possibility. Silence is usually defined by negation. It is described as what remains when sound stops or when thought ends. By this definition, Silence seems empty. Ibn Arabi reverses this logic. Silence is not defined by what it lacks, but by what it allows. If silence were truly empty, nothing could appear within it. Thought could not arise. Perception could not register. Knowing could not occur. Yet all of these do occur. This suggests that silence is not a void, but a capacity. You are invited to examine whether awareness requires internal commentary to operate. Does knowing need explanation in order to be present? Or does the explanation simply overlay something already complete? When commentary ceases, awareness does not collapse. It becomes less obscure. Silence does not remove knowing. It removes interference. This does not mean silence is special or rare. It means it is misinterpreted. The difficulty lies in expectation. You expect silence to feel like something dramatic. When it does not, you assume it is nothing. Ibn Arabi points out that this expectation is itself a form of noise. The question sharpens. Does silence limit knowing, or does it remove the distortion introduced by thought? The answer cannot be supplied conceptually. It must be recognized through careful reasoning. Ordinary knowing is structured by division. There is a knower on one side and an object on the other. Thought organizes experience through this separation. It says, I know this. Ibn Arabi suggests that this structure belongs to thought, not to awareness itself. In silence, there is no internal declaration of a knower, standing apart from what is known, and yet knowing remains. This creates a paradox. How can knowing occur without distance? You are invited to question whether distance is essential to knowing, or whether it is added afterward for the sake of explanation. Thought requires separation in order to function. Awareness does not. When knowing is not divided, it is not owned. There is no claim of authorship. There is no assertion of control. This does not result in confusion. It results in clarity without commentary. The discomfort arises because identity is usually tied to the role of knower. If knowing occurs without a knower, the sense of self loses its central position. Ibn Arabi does not treat this as a problem. He treats it as a correction. The inquiry deepens. Is knowing always relational, or can it be immediate without opposition? If the latter is true, silence is not passive. It is precise. At this point, you may begin to search for silence as an experience. You may wait for a particular mental condition, a sustained quiet, or a recognizable state. Ibn Arabi warns that this search misunderstands the matter entirely. Silence is not an event that occurs within awareness. It is what makes events intelligible in the first place. To look for silence as an experience is to treat it as an object. This turns it into another appearance among appearances. The paradox becomes clear. If silence must be experienced, it is no longer silence. It has become content. The very act of searching reintroduces mental movement and commentary. They're asked to notice something subtle. Silence is never absent. What comes and goes is attention to thought. When attention relaxes, silence is revealed, not produced. This explains why silence is so often overlooked. It does not announce itself. It does not feel distinct. It is ordinary. Too ordinary to be noticed by a mind trained to seek novelty. Ibn Arabi's correction is firm but simple. Stop searching for silence. Notice what remains when searching. Ends. The inquiry does not add anything. It removes a misunderstanding. Much of what you call awareness is actually commentary. You label, judge, compare, and explain. These functions are useful, but they are not awareness itself. Ibn Arabi separates awareness from all forms of internal narration. Awareness does not affirm or deny. It does not approve or reject. It does not describe what it knows. It simply knows. Commentary arises afterward and claims ownership of the knowing. This distinction is easy to miss because commentary is loud and familiar. Awareness is quiet and constant. I've learned to identify with the voice rather than with the knowing that precedes it. The question arises naturally. Does commentary clarify knowing, or does it replace it with interpretation? When you describe an experience, do you become closer to it, or do you move one step away? Ibn Arabi does not argue against thought. He places it in its proper position. Thought is a tool, not a foundation. When it is mistaken for awareness itself, confusion follows. Silence reveals this distinction without effort. When commentary pauses, awareness does not disappear. It becomes evident. The recognition does not require agreement. It requires attention. If awareness does not speak, where does the sense of I come from? This question cannot be avoided. Ibn Arabi locates identity within thought, not within awareness. The self is constructed through narrative. It depends on memory, anticipation, and internal affirmation. When these functions pause, the narrative self is not confirmed. Yet awareness remains intact. This does not mean the self is destroyed. It means it is revealed as contingent. It exists when thought supports it and recedes when thought relaxes. Awareness does not depend on this narrative. You are invited to consider whether the self requires constant mental reinforcement to exist. If it does, it cannot be fundamental. It must be an appearance. In silence, there is no declaration of identity. No one says, I am here. And yet knowing persists. This challenges the assumption that awareness belongs to a self. Ibn Arabi's insight destabilizes identity without creating loss. What falls away is not awareness, but the claim of ownership. Silence does not erase knowing. It removes the need for a knower. Thoughts, emotions, and perceptions shift continuously. This movement is undeniable. Ibn Arabi points to something that does not move with them, yet registers them completely. Silence does not oppose activity. It does not suppress change. It accommodates change without being altered by it. This is why it is often mistaken for passivity. You are asked to examine whether non-reactive knowing is weak or stable. If awareness reacted to every change, it would fragment. Its stability lies in its non-interference. This does not imply indifference. Everything is known precisely, but nothing is resisted. Silence does not need to adjust itself to each new appearance. The paradox becomes apparent. What seems inactive is actually what allows all activity to be known. What seems empty is what holds everything without strain. Ibn Arabi's reasoning removes a subtle fear. You do not lose engagement by recognizing silence. You lose unnecessary resistance. Awareness does not withdraw. It becomes unobstructed. The question resolves slowly. Is this non-reactive knowing passive? Or is it the only form of awareness that does not exhaust itself? Once silence is recognized, a new impulse often appears. You may try to maintain it. You may fear its loss. Ibn Arabi identifies this as another misunderstanding. Silence cannot be held because it was never acquired. The attempt to preserve it assumes it is fragile. This assumption reintroduces effort and commentary. Effort implies a goal. Silence is not a goal. It is the condition in which goals appear. When you try to protect it, you treat it as something separate from yourself. This creates disturbance, not because silence is disturbed, but because attention becomes divided. One part watches, another part tries to control. Ibn Arabi would say that nothing needs to be done. Silence does not need maintenance. It was present before the attempt to hold it and remains after the attempt fails. The correction is gentle. Stop trying to keep silence. Notice that it has not gone anywhere. Effort obscures what it seeks to secure. The inquiry simplifies. Does silence need protection? Or is protection itself a distraction? The inquiry no longer seeks an answer. You recognize that silence was never something to reach. It was what allowed every question to appear. Ibn Arabi's insight resolves without emphasis. Awareness does not arise from thought, and silence is not its absence. Silence is the condition in which knowing occurs without division, ownership, or effort. Nothing needs to be added. Nothing needs to be removed. Original assumption quietly dissolves. Silence does not oppose knowing. It is the knowing that does not speak. The opening question no longer demands a response. It dissolves into clarity, not as a conclusion, but as recognition of what was never absent.